Hey everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with the 8-day unilateral extension of a contract. So we're going to talk about it and where it is in the various forms and just a lot of information. So let's start at the beginning. Where is it that the buyer and the seller agree upon a unilateral extension? Well, let's even back up further from there. When a buyer and a seller go under contract in the purchase and sale agreement, there is a place for the buyer and the seller to put in a specific closing date. So buyer and seller negotiate that, and that demonstrates a meeting of the minds with a specific closing date. Then, as you guys all know as agents, there are different circumstances that occur that potentially delay a closing. So how is it that a buyer and a seller would extend a closing if they need to change it or even make it earlier? Well, basically a buyer and a seller would use an amendment to change anything that they had already agreed upon in the contract. So they would use an amendment to change the closing and possession date if it was going to change from anything that had been agreed to in the initial binding contract. So as you know, an amendment requires agreement. So you must have both the buyer and the seller's signature to amend anything in a contract for that matter, but specifically in this instance to change the closing date. So you could use just a general amendment form, or in the GAR contract package, there is amendment to change closing and possession date, and it is form F104. And I'll get back to that form in just a minute. So then what is it that you keep hearing about a unilateral right to extend closing? Well, first of all, what does unilateral mean? Unilateral means one-sided. So you would only need one party's signature, either the buyer's signature or the seller's signature. So how is it that one party can hold another party into a contract against their will? Well, first of all, why do I say against their will? Well, if you were going to do it with both parties agreeing, then of course you would do it with an amendment and both parties sign and agree. So in the GAR purchase and sale agreement, when the parties agree and go binding under that contract without any special stipulations to the contrary, they do agree to that one party or the other, either party, may unilaterally extend the contract, meaning just with their signature, for 8 days. So let me point out to you where this is, and it's not just for any reason, so let me point that out. In the GAR purchase and sale agreement, which is form F20, in paragraph B4, it talks about closing and possession, and paragraph B4A states right to extend closing date. Buyer or seller may unilaterally extend the closing date for 8 days upon notice to the other party given prior to the date of closing. So whichever party is going to extend it, you have to do it with a notice form, and I've done other videos on notice, so you must use the proper forms of notice, and that notice to extend must be done prior to the already contracted for closing date. They can only do it under these circumstances. 1, if the seller cannot satisfy valid title objections, excluding, meaning as long as those title objections cannot be satisfied through the payment of money or bonding off of the same. In other words, if there's just a lien, that doesn't give anyone the right to use the unilateral extension. And B, the title objections do not prevent the seller from conveying good and marketable title as that term is defined in the purchase and sale agreement. So that's the first reason. Title issues, as long as those title issues cannot be paid off or bonded off, and as long as those title issues do not prevent the seller from conveying good and marketable title. Number 2, the buyer's mortgage lender, even in an all-cash transaction where the buyer is obtaining a mortgage loan, or the closing attorney is delayed and cannot fulfill their respective obligations by the date of closing, provided that the delay is not caused by the buyer. So either the mortgage lender or the closing attorney can't get the job done on their end as long as the delay isn't caused by the buyer. And I'll get back to the all cash part in a second. 3, the buyer has not received the required estimates of disclosures from the mortgage lender, and this has to do with the TRID laws from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, those laws and federal regulations that are in place for TRID. And if the buyer has not received the required estimates or disclosures, then the buyer is prohibited from closing, and again, that's federal regulation. The party unilaterally extending the closing date shall state the basis for the delay in the notice of the extension. If the right to unilaterally extend the closing is exercised once by either party, the right thereafter shall terminate. So a couple things. There are certain title issues and certain lending issues, but a seller may extend even if it's a lending issue, and a buyer may extend even if it's a title issue. So you don't have to stay with your side of the deal, so to speak. But again, it is on those very specific conditions. Second thing to remember, it can only be used once per contract, not once per side, but once per contract. So this is going to be a last case scenario when you want to use the unilateral extension, because again, you're holding one of the parties into contract against their will, because if it was with their will, they would have signed an amendment. Now, all right, I'll get to that in a second. So if one of the parties is going to send notice to use the unilateral extension, again, you can just do it just on a blank notice form, but you also have to state the reasons. GAR has a form already that has all that information for you to fill in the blank. It's GAR F-133, notice to unilaterally extend the closing for 8 days. And you have the date, you have the buyer's name, the seller's name, and the property address. And then it indicates if it's the buyer or the seller, which is the party that's actually giving the notice, and then the reason. And the reasons are just a reiteration of what's in the purchase and sale agreement, but you must mark what that reason is. And then again, you only need the signature of the party giving notice. So either buyer or seller, you do not need the other party's signature. And this notice must be not only completed, but completed and delivered prior to the already contracted closing date, whether that closing date be from the original binding agreement date or if it's already been extended by an amendment. So again, that's the form you are going to use for that. Now, another thing to consider is if you are going to extend a closing date by an amendment, then again, you could do this as a general amendment, or as I already referenced, the GAR form F-104, amendment to change closing and possession. In this form, it does have an option where the buyer and the seller, so if you are extending by an amendment, it does have an option where the buyer and the seller indicate the right to unilaterally extend the closing for up to 8 days as provided for in the right to extend closing paragraph, which we just read, is hereby terminated or shall remain in effect. So if the parties are extending using an amendment, make sure to address that issue in the amendment. Now, the other thing is, let me talk about where it can even be used in an all-cash transaction. You're thinking, my gosh, how could it be used in an all-cash transaction where the buyer's getting a mortgage? Well, an all-cash transaction doesn't necessarily mean all cash. An all-cash transaction typically refers to a buyer purchasing a property without a financing contingency. So the funds that they're using to purchase the property, either they actually are using cash or they are getting a mortgage loan. It's just not that they're not making the contract contingent upon them receiving that financing. So the GAR form, all cash sale, no financing contingency, that exhibit is F-79. And there is a provision when buyer and seller up front in the purchase and sale agreement are negotiating. There is a provision, number 2, right to unilaterally extend the closing date. It says, and again, it's the all cash exhibit, but it's either truly all cash or it is just a buyer's getting financing, but they're just not making the deal contingent upon that. And it states, paragraph 2, if the buyer obtains mortgage financing to purchase all or any portion of the property, the buyer and the seller negotiate. shall have the right to unilaterally extend the contract for 8 days or shall not have the right to unilaterally extend the contract for 8 days. Because even though a buyer would be getting a mortgage loan and not making their deal contingent upon that, the mortgage lender still could be held up before they're able to process the loan, or could not get out those TRID disclosures, in which case the buyer, all cash buyer, so to speak, would want to potentially, would have the right, or the seller for that matter, to unilaterally extend the closing for 8 days. So I just wanted to make you aware of where that provision is talked about in those forms. Now, another thing to talk about is 8 days. Well, let's think about this. This only comes into play if your original closing date or an amended closing date falls on a Friday. Because if you close on a Friday, if that's the original closing date is a Friday, or again, it's amended to a Friday, what day of the week is 8 days from Friday? Well, we've got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Can you close on a Saturday? Well, let's see what the contract says. As you guys know, in all of my classes and in these videos, I always tell you the contract is nothing more than a set of instructions. So in the instructions, in the purchase and sale agreement, we go back and we read in paragraph C4, other provisions, under subparagraph I, extension of deadlines. No time deadline under this agreement shall be extended by virtue of it falling on a Saturday, Sunday, or federal holiday, except for the date of closing. So what that means is if you have a purchase and sale agreement and one of the contingency timeframes, like the due diligence, financing contingency, appraisal contingency, if one of those deadlines falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or federal holiday, it doesn't matter. That deadline is not extended. However, if a closing falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or federal holiday, then that does get automatically extended to the next business day. So, if your original closing date is on a Friday and you're binding under the GAR contract, or the parties amend it to close on a Friday, as we said, 8 days from Friday falls on a Saturday. By virtue of the purchase and sale agreement, that deadline is going to automatically get extended. So you can't close on a Saturday, wouldn't close that day. Can't close on a Sunday, wouldn't close that day. So it would move to Monday, unless Monday is a federal holiday. Monday is a federal holiday, then it would get moved to Tuesday. So let's see, we have an 8-day unilateral extension that now possibly is extended for 11 days. That is a long time to hold the other party in a contract against their will. And again, they didn't agree to it. So if you are going binding under a GAR purchase and sale agreement, don't close on a Friday, because potentially the parties are locked in to each other if the deal gets extended based on one of those reasons for 10 or 11 days. Why am I just talking about the GAR contract form? Well, if you go binding, if the buyer and the seller go binding under the RE contract form, there is no 8-day unilateral provision to extend unilaterally. Said that a little bit redundant. So it's not a law, it's just a contract provision in the GAR contract form. So if the buyer and the seller go binding under another contract form, there's not an automatic 8-day unilateral extension. So you can't hang your hat on that if, for whatever reason, the lender or the closing attorney or whatever can't close on the last contractual date. The parties either need to amend to a new closing date, or whichever party can't close on that date is going to default on the contract. So again, it's not a law, and if the buyer and the seller go binding under the GAR contract, they can negotiate that paragraph out of it too. All you would do is write a special stipulation that says all parties agree paragraph B4A is no longer part of this contract. So there are ways for the buyer and the seller to address that issue. You still, if the lender has not given out the mandatory disclosures per the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the TRID laws, then federal regulations prohibit you from closing anyway. So there are all kinds of things to take into account when the parties go binding on a purchase and sale agreement, that different issues that may affect the closing date. Best case scenario is to make sure that you get agreement between the buyer and the seller to extend it. But if you are going to use the 8-day unilateral extension as provided for in the GAR purchase and sale agreement, hopefully you have a little more information to help you out with that provision and to explain it to your buyers and sellers. Thank you so much for watching. Hope this contract tip helped you out. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.